you wanted to say a few words by way of preface to the evidence that you'll be giving.
Thank you, Mr. Keith. Yes, thank you for having me here today. I just wanted to start by saying how deeply sorry I am to all of those who lost loved ones, family members through the pandemic, and also all those who suffered in the various different ways throughout the pandemic and as a result of the actions were taken. I've thought a lot about this over the past couple of years. It's important that we learn the lessons so that we can be better prepared in the future, and it's in that spirit and with enormous respect for all of those who are affected that I'm here today, and I look forward to giving evidence in a spirit of constructive candour to help the...
As is very well known, Mr. Sunak, you were elected Member of Parliament for Richmond in Yorkshire in May 2015. You then became, in January 2018, a junior minister at what was then the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. You then became Chief Secretary to the Treasury in July of 2019. And most relevantly for our purposes, in February 2020, did you become Chancellor of the Exchequer after Sajid Javid MP. You remained Chancellor of the Exchequer until July of 22, so after the conclusion of the coronavirus pandemic crisis, and of course you became Prime Minister on the 25th of October 2022 following the resignation of Liz Truss as leader of the Conservative Party. That is all correct, is it not?
Yes, it is.
Mr. Sunak, I'd like to start, please, just with some of the forensic building blocks underpinning your evidence today and the issue of the provision of material to the inquiry. In your statement, you set out how you rarely use text to communicate with colleagues. Your phone, you said, doesn't retain, and nor do you have access to text messages at all relating to the period of the crisis. And in addition, you said although on occasion you use WhatsApp to communicate around meetings and logistics and so on, you generally were only party to WhatsApp groups that were set up to deal with individual circumstances such as arrangements for calls, meetings and so on and so forth. Is that broadly correct?
Yes, that is all broadly correct.
You don't now have access to any of the WhatsApps that you did send during the time of the crisis, do you?
No, I don't. I've changed my phone multiple times over the past few years, and as that has happened, the messages have not come across. As you said, I'm not a prolific user of WhatsApp in the first instance, primarily communication with my private office, and obviously anything that was of significance through those conversations or exchanges will have been recorded officially by my civil servants, as one would expect.
Evidence has been given to the inquiry to the effect that Mr. Johnson announced the institution of this inquiry in May 2021. And around that time, officials discussed the need for ministers and others to retain WhatsApps. It was a matter of debate, in fact, in WhatsApp communications between officials themselves. Around that time, April and May 2021, did nobody say to you, Chancellor, it's important that you do retain your WhatsApps, or we need to put into place measures for them to be backed up in case they become relevant to an inquiry?
No, I don't recall either of those conversations that you referred to between officials, but you might have been referring to officials in number 10 rather than the Treasury. And yes, and I don't recall anyone in my office making that recommendation or observation to me at the time.
Do you happen to recall, it's probably quite a long shot, but do you recall changing phones around that time as it happened?
Not around that time, as I said. I have changed my phone multiple times in the years since then, and as I said previously, every time that's happened, the messages wouldn't have come across. But as I said, I'm not a prolific user of WhatsApp, and with the private office again, that would have all been recorded formally on the record, or indeed where I've had exchanges with other individuals. Some of those have been part of the evidence that's formed the inquiry's deliberations.
They have indeed, and I should make plain that we've got some of your messages from the other interlocutors to the communications. Now, turning to the role of Chancellor of the Exchequer, and it is, of course, because you were Chancellor of the Exchequer that your evidence today is of the greatest importance. You describe how, in your statement, how there was obviously, throughout the currency of the entire crisis, a clash between public health epidemiological considerations and economic and fiscal issues, both by way of the economic considerations which had to be taken into account by the government, and also the vast economic and societal damage that would be done by decisions such as lockdowns. In that debate, which raged throughout the pandemic, what was the general position of the Chancellor of the Exchequer? What position generally did you and Her Majesty's Treasury take?
Well, I don't think I ever referred to it as a clash. I think I saw my role as Chancellor of the Exchequer as making sure that the Prime Minister had the best possible advice, information, analysis relating to the economic impact or consequences of some of the decisions that he was having to make. Obviously, the Chancellor of the Exchequer's role is to be responsible for the country's economic and fiscal policy and the financial services sector. So that was my primary responsibility in the role. And then as it pertained to the pandemic, my jobs were not just to design and implement economic interventions like the furlough scheme or support for public services and businesses, but also, as I said, to provide analysis and advice to the Prime Minister as he made his decisions. And more broadly, just touching on what you said at the beginning, Ms. Kyiv, as a senior cabinet minister, one of the consistent arguments or points that I made from the beginning throughout was just making sure that we collectively in the Prime Minister considered the totality of the impacts of the decisions that we were making. It wasn't, I didn't ever describe it as a clash just between public health and economics. I think that's to think about it in far too narrow a way. As many people have alluded to, and I did at the time, there were a range of impacts, many of them socioeconomic, the impact on children's education, on mental health, on the issue in the criminal justice system, as well as the pure economic impact. And it was important that policymakers considered the totality of those, and that was a consistent point throughout. But obviously, my particular responsibility was the economy and fiscal policy.
You do, I think, refer to how the issues confronting the government consisted of highly compelling, competing interests. Would that be a fair summary?
Yes, I think that is right. Again, as I said, none of these decisions were easy, as I think everyone has acknowledged, and the Prime Minister's incredibly difficult job was to have to balance many competing interests and make the best decision with the evidence and advice available to him at the time. And again, only he could do that because only he saw the totality of those, with input coming from various different cabinet ministers with their domains of expertise and responsibility.
We'll see in a moment some examples of the way in which the arguments were promoted by HMT, Her Majesty's Treasury. In general terms, however, was it a question of putting before the Prime Minister your and HMT's views on the likely consequences of whatever decision might be taken by him, or did you engage in the ultimate debate as to what should be done? Did you promote a particular outcome in relation to, for example, lockdown decisions, decisions to ease, decisions to institute a roadmap, decisions whether or not to have a circuit breaker and so on? Did you promote a particular position as part of your role as Chancellor of the Exchequer, or was it just a question of providing a broad advice as to the consequences?
I think it's probably difficult to generalise in that way. It would depend on the decision confronting the Prime Minister or the committee or the meeting that I would be participating in. So it wouldn't be one consistent answer throughout the pandemic. It would be context specific. But as a general rule, my primary responsibility was to feed in advice and analysis as to the economic consequences of what was being considered. Of course, where the Prime Minister would ask for my broader opinion, I'd always be happy to give it to him if it was something that I thought I could offer on the basis of some element of knowledge. But broadly, primarily my role was to feed in the economic advice and analysis, and I can provide opinions to the Prime Minister as and when he would have requested them.
And do we take it from the fact that this advice was given to the Prime Minister, that the Prime Minister ultimately was the decision maker who mattered? It's notable that a great deal of the advice that you provided was directed exclusively at the Prime Minister, as opposed to perhaps exclusively or in large part to Cabinet or the other bodies. Of course you address them as well, but the final decision making appears to be concerned solely with the Prime Minister.
Well, I think it's absolutely right to say that the Prime Minister, as I say in my evidence, was the ultimate and sole decision maker. I don't think that's particularly controversial or challenged. Only he has the ability to make those decisions across competing interests. I wouldn't say it's fair to say I only fed advice into him. I mean, I'm sure we'll go on to discuss it shortly, but there were various committee structures that were set up to facilitate that decision making and provide forum for debate and discussion where the Prime Minister could hear different views from colleagues and obviously through bilateral meetings as well. So there was an extensive process by which information was shared. Often in the first instance, the Treasury would be sharing, or I would be sharing that information with, as it later became, the COVID task force, whose job it was to coordinate and synthesize information from many departments to put together to Cabinet or Cabinet committees, or presumably the Prime Minister himself, so that he could make his decision.
There was indeed a very developed process, and it was a process that altered over time.
Yes.
The government put into place a number of changes in order to make it work better, and we can see the progress from the MIGs at the beginning to COVID-S and COVID-O and so on. But the material shows, Mr. Sunak, that when it came to a hard-edged decision, whether or not the Prime Minister would impose a lockdown or not impose a circuit breaker or institute the tier system, the Treasury was astute to ensure that it provided its opinion to the Prime Minister to the very last moment. You would try, in effect, to get the last word to say, Prime Minister, these are the consequences of whatever decision you will take, and you need to know what they are.
I'm not sure that's a fair characterization. The Prime Minister obviously is responsible for setting up the decision-making structures that work best for him, and he had done that through the task force, the COVID-Os and S's, complemented by bilateral meetings with different ministers. All of that really is a question for the Prime Minister as to how he wanted to hear the arguments and see the evidence and analysis from colleagues. And I participated in all of those, as was my job. And I certainly felt that I always had that opportunity. So there was no point did I feel that I didn't have that opportunity to input analysis or my point of view into the process. But in general, the way that decisions were made was through the committee structures that he had set up, COVID-O, COVID-S, and Cabinet, for the most part. That's where decisions were taken. Now, there may be an iterative process leading up to that final decision-making meeting, but again, that question for the Prime Minister as to how he liked to organise that. For my part, I would say I was always able to feed in appropriately and adequately into those mechanisms, and ultimately it was up to him how he wanted to hear the different views from different people. But ultimately the decision was made in one of those forums, as one would expect in the way our system of government works.
And so that we're absolutely clear about this, there was never a time when you felt that you didn't have an adequate opportunity of making your views plain. Whatever it was that you wished to say about the various difficult decisions that the Prime Minister faced, you had that opportunity.
Yeah, as a general observation about my reflection over the period, I don't sit here today thinking, gosh, there were many opportunities where I didn't have that opportunity. As a general rule, I always felt that I could. I mean, I saw the Prime Minister probably more than I saw my own wife for this period of time. We were working very closely together, as I was with my other Cabinet colleagues, and as a general rule, I was able to participate in everything that I felt I needed to or ought to in order to get the evidence analysis to him in a way that he could use it to make decisions.
Let's look for a moment at the structure of the way by which material was and analysis was put before the Prime Minister. Have you set out in your statement, and we'll have, please, the statement at page 23, the various different ways in which HMT analysis was shared with the Cabinet Office and the Prime Minister. There were shared weekly monitoring products. There was a regular economy update meeting. You refer to particular advice on the 14th of February, a paper in March. There was then a rolling process by which HMT officials contributed to Cabinet Office advice for the Prime Minister on the reopening of non-essential retail. There were obviously publications of your own department's economic analysis. We can see that at paragraph 75. And going back a page to page 22, paragraph 72, have you provided certain particularly important papers around about the time of the first lockdown decision, dated the 12th and 15th of March, and then after the decision, the 15th of April? We'll have a quick look at one or two of those to see the nature at that time of the Treasury intervention. So 232069, INQ 232069. We can see here a document with a readout of a Prime Ministerial meeting on Sunday, the 15th of March, so the day before the lockdown decision. Prime Minister, that's correct, isn't it? For a meeting at 5 p.m, the PM commissioned advice on further options. It was agreed that a package of announcements would be put to COBRA on Monday the 16th. And then you can see at the bottom of the page, summary of papers to PM. And then information about the various options confronting him: household isolation, atypical setting, shielding, social distancing, and so on. If we look at page 5, you'll see HMT position, and did your department set out in relation to each of the particular interventions or social distancing measures what the consequences would be or would be likely to be in terms of impact economically and fiscally. And then if we look over the pages to 6 and 8, we can see what the impact would be fiscally in terms of a number of other particular options. So does that give a fair indication of the sort of information which your department provided to the Prime Minister?
I mean, yes. All I'd say is this was very, very early on, as you said. So this was, we were weeks into this, and I think what you'll see over the duration of the next 18 months is the quality and I'd say extra granularity of the information that an analysis we were able to provide improved considerably. The focus early on, as you can see, was on labour supply impacts and analysing days that would be lost through isolation policies. Obviously, as the pandemic and in the following weeks, the Treasury was able to significantly increase the sophistication with which it was modelling the impacts of things, not least because they were actually happening. It broadened the use of data that we had access to on a much more real-time basis from non-traditional sources. It procured and developed other models, particularly at a microeconomic level, on firm-level impacts on employment and insolvency, and it extensively engaged with external experts as well. So I think this is very early on. As the pandemic progressed, what you'll see is, as I said, that the detailed nature of the analysis will have improved considerably over time.
Would it be fair to say that perhaps on account of the speed with which the first lockdown decision was made, the degree of fiscal and economic analysis that was placed before the Prime Minister by comparison to later was significantly different? There was a much narrower debate, if you like, about the economic and fiscal consequences at that time by comparison to the second and third lockdown decisions.
I think that is fair, not least because this was so unpredictable and uncertain. Once we had entered into the first lockdown, then you actually had data as to the impact of these measures, and you could use those to forecast what would happen in the future when you were going to repeat them. But at this point, this was not something that anyone had grappled with before or modelled with any precision. So it was very hard to be precise about the impacts. And as I said, we developed more modelling capability, broadened the source of data over time, and external groups like the OBR, who is, of course, the government's independent forecaster themselves, and about the middle of April published quite extensive independent forecasting of the impact on the economy from COVID. And again, they continue to iterate that, as did the Bank of England and other external bodies. So I think there was just a considerable body of external and internal work that was done from this point onwards. But as you say, this was very early on. In terms of the other economic information that was relevant around exactly the same time as this note was the situation in the gilt markets.
We'll come to that.
Oh, fine. It was around the same kind of time, yeah, just days after that, from memory.
In fact, the lockdown decision was the 23rd, and the debate about the gilt markets was on the Thursday before. So the
19th was the first conversation I had with him, and then followed up with...
We'll look at that in a moment.
Fine.
We'll have another look at another document, 232115. This is a document dated the 15th of April 2020, so after the lockdown decision. The Cabinet Office produced a paper, COVID-19 Social Distancing Review Summary Data Deck, and we can see from pages 5 to 7 and 9 to 11 a considerable amount of information and analysis provided about the economic impact of course, what was then the lockdown, and we can see the sort of detail into which it descends. Would that sort of economic and societal analysis have been produced by HMT?
I mean, I think what you'll see from that presentation, I think it was produced by the Cabinet Office rather than the Treasury, so no doubt the Treasury would have fed into that, and I would imagine worked closely, particularly with economic departments like BEIS or DFT, for example, and I saw them, or DWP, and I saw those departments, I think at least a couple of them referenced in some of the slides that you showed. So, of course, Treasury would have fed into that alongside those departments and would have been working closely with them to think through the impact.
You've described how ultimately many of the most momentous decisions were matters for the Prime Minister. I'd like to ask you, please, about your understanding of where and when those sorts of decisions were taken. The inquiry has received a considerable amount of evidence about the debates and the decision-making processes that went on around the Prime Minister with his closest advisors, effectively debates in the Cabinet room at 9:15 meetings, in meetings of the Prime Minister and his advisors. Did you form a view yourself as to the divide between the taking of those decisions by the Prime Minister and his advisors and the necessary debate which had to take place in Cabinet? Did you believe that Cabinet was in any way being sidelined, as one or two witnesses have suggested?
You know, that's not my strong recollection. I mean, to reiterate what I said before, first and foremost, I was always in a position where I felt I had the opportunity to provide the Prime Minister with relevant advice and information that he needed. That's the first thing to say. I think the second broad observation I have was that the COVID-O and COVID-S structure actually worked, I thought, quite well. It was modelled on something that had the Prime Minister himself, I think, had brought in during the Brexit process. So it was a template that I participated on, more at the O level in those days. So it's a template that had been used before, had been shown to work. My general recollection is that it was a good structure, and it did that separation between broader strategy and operations. I thought was a structure that made sense, and I found typically effective. I think my significant recollection of this time was the lack of the task force model early on, which was corrected by about June and then improved as well over time. And I think that was an improvement. And I think actually that is a model that now is ready to be deployed off the shelf, and rightly so. But not having a task force at the centre that I think it was described as the gearbox or the engine room that could synthesise across departments the information and analysis and advice coming in for the Prime Minister to present things in the round, together with input from Sage, I think was a necessary and an important step in improving the quality of the decision-making and the sharing of information. And so that was not there in the first couple of months. And clearly, at that phase, it was DH were described as the lead department with the response, particularly in March and April. And I think if this happened again, one would want to make sure that that task force model was there from the beginning, day one, day zero, because that definitely improved things.
It was Mr. Cummings who referred to the Cabinet Office as being a gearbox, but with sand in it. Did you, as Chancellor, take a view as to the efficiency of the Cabinet Office, particularly in those early days from March through to May, by which time, as you rightly say, the COVID-S, COVID-O structure was put into place?
I think it was very difficult. I think it's obviously easy to sit here now and say task force was better. Of course it was. COVID-O and COVID-S was better. Yes, of course it was, and it improved decision making. I think those first few weeks were extremely difficult for everybody. I don't doubt that everyone was trying very hard to do the best that they could in trying circumstances, dealing with something that we hadn't dealt with before. So it's, I wouldn't sit here and say that people weren't doing the best they could. I think they were. But it's clear that the task force structure, the O and the S structures, made things, I think, work more effectively and efficiently, and they were not there right at the beginning. And it's good that they were implemented, and good that they continue to improve over time. But I think the other thing I'd say is, I think there is this perception that somehow decisions are not being made in these fora, but I think they're really, my strong recollection is that they were. I mean, the COVID-Os and COVID-S were the places where an appropriate group of people came together to discuss, to deliberate, for the Prime Minister to make his decision. Now, there's obviously a trade-off between speed of decision-making and the number of people involved. I mean, it was ever thus, and I think there's probably no perfect answer. Ultimately, it's for the Prime Minister to himself figure out what the right balance between those two things is. Broadly, I thought that the over-S structure did that. But also, decision-making is an iterative process. That's the reality of government. I think what would be normal is that there would be a series of potentially bilateral meetings or a small group meeting leading up to the final decision meeting. I think that's completely fine. Every Prime Minister will have a different decision-making process that works for them. That's the previous Prime Minister, I think, liked that. I think nothing wrong with it, quite healthy. It allowed him time to digest the arguments. So I don't think there's anything wrong with there being a series of meetings considering the same topic before a final COVID-O, COVID-S or cabinet meeting to take the final decision.
Your answer, at least at the start, Mr. Sunak, was heavily predicated upon the existence of COVID-S and COVID-O. But in the earlier period, particularly around the time of the first lockdown and those decisions in March and April, the evidence from a number of witnesses is to the effect that there was a circumvention of cabinet governance, a certain level of dysfunction, and I emphasise it's only evidence, and these are all matters from a lady in due course, but the witnesses have spoken about dysfunction in number 10 in the Cabinet Office, and how the system around the Prime Minister was not working well, to put it neutrally. That must have been something that was apparent to you as the occupant of number 11. You could not have seen how number 10 was responding to this unprecedented crisis.
So you described, not my, but people saying about dysfunction in number 10 or the Cabinet Office. Obviously, I didn't work directly in number 10 or in the Cabinet Office. So it's hard for me to comment on that, other than to say that my interactions with number 10 and the Cabinet Office during this period felt fine to me. Again, I go back to, broadly, was I able to input advice to the Prime Minister or when decisions were being made? I felt I was. I didn't feel I'd been shut out or not able to participate. And my recollection of that period, that early period, was a series of, I think as it was then, as you say, not COVID-O or COVID-S, they were probably COBRA meetings, which involved groups of people considering these things. So lots of people were around the table, was my recollection, at the key moments on the 16th of March, the 9th of March. As far as I can remember, at all of those points, there was a Cobra meeting. I was probably at it. There were minutes that were circulated, or SAGE minutes that had been circulated that form part of the advice pack. Deliberations were made, decisions were taken quite quickly and acted on in all of those key moments. So that's my general recollection of the period. You're absolutely right, and as I've said, the formal task force structure and the ONDS structure hadn't been established at this point, but things were moving so quickly, and largely, as I'm sure we'll get on to, the government, the Prime Minister, just largely acted on the advice that was put in front of him from SAGE with regard to what interventions to implement at what time. I mean, that's my strong recollection of this period, of those 3 weeks in March.
My strong recollection of this period is the advice would come in from SAGE. Obviously, that advice changed over the weeks, which I'm sure we'll get into. But largely, my recollection is the government acted on the advice it was given with regard to interventions, and the economic advice, as you pointed to, was provided. I mean, I'd say not just for information, that's to downplay it, but it was not driving the conversation, and that's right in the way that you've described it.
In your statement, you describe how you would, in addition to these formal procedures, see the Prime Minister informally, but that no decisions of significance were made in those situations, and you state all major decisions were made within formal structures. But presumably, during these informal debates, COVID was at least part, if not the predominant part of the debate, and how economically and fiscally there were issues to be debated.
Yes, I think when I was talking about that, I wasn't referring to this period. I mean, I didn't know the Prime Minister particularly well at this point in time when I became Chancellor. Obviously, that relationship grew over time, and both of us living in the same building. So this went on for almost 2 years. So over the course of that period, as we got to know each other better, there's clearly more opportunities for, we might be sitting in the garden together at the weekend or something. So as is completely normal. So it wouldn't just be COVID, because by the point those types of conversations were happening between us, there were other things as well.
Not just COVID, but of course always with an economic or fiscal bent to it. That is, of course, what your role was. You were the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Yes, I would say all our conversations were work-related. We were also able to talk about things that were not work-related. But I'd say my conversations on policy would obviously be predominantly based on the economic and fiscal considerations of what we were doing.
Of course, they were debates about the matters which were of the greatest concern to the government at that time. That is why, of course, you were discussing them with the Prime Minister. I asked...
Yes, I think there is a distinction. I think you just work with colleagues, and if you happen to be neighbours, it's impossible not to see each other outside of a formal COVID-S meeting. That's just the practical reality of being neighbours and sharing a garden and living in the same building. So it would be weird not to have had conversations about life, family, friends, work at the same time. But in terms of decision-making structures, as I'm very clear that there was rigorous and proper debate and deliberation with colleagues in those structures after they were set up, and even before that, more generally. And that was my consistent view throughout. I mean, those debates and deliberations did happen throughout, with not just me, but with other colleagues as well.
I ask, as you know well, because of the article in The Spectator, Rishi Sunak on What We Weren't Told, dated the 27th of August 22, in which the author of the article says that you said that you tried not to challenge the Prime Minister in public or leave a paper trail. I'd say a lot of stuff to him in private. This is, of course, it's on page 8 if you want to see it in all its glory. This is all, of course, in the context of COVID. The article is, of course, about your role in COVID. And as I say, it says he tried not to challenge the Prime Minister in public or leave a paper trail. I'd say a lot of stuff to him in private. there's some written record of everything. In general, people leak it and it causes problems. Why, if you were debating these hugely important topics with the Prime Minister, was it important not to leave a paper trail?
Well, I think, as the article said, that's not something that I've said. The quote from me is, I'd say a lot of stuff to him in private. And in fact, there is some written record of everything. So, I mean, of course, I had conversations with the Prime Minister. As I said, you share a garden, your neighbours, you live together. Of course, there'd be conversations I'd be having with him. And in terms of written records, I mean, I'm sure we'll get onto it. At multiple moments, I would write to him with just so that he could have it in one place, a set of thoughts or analysis from me with regard perhaps to exit roadmaps or the 2 metre to 1 metre, and there'll be others, or travel. Yeah, so there's there is actually, in fact, lots of different bits of evidence that you have and that we've provided of when I did actually write to him formally at particular points where I thought it made sense to lay out a set of arguments from me to him.
And we will look at some of the bilateral. There are many, many bilateral meetings where formally your officials and yourself and the Prime Minister and his officials met to talk about COVID-related issues as well as all the other economically related issues you raise. It's just that what is the inquiry to make of the suggestion here, to which you do appear to lend your support, that there was a form of communication between the Prime Minister that was not recorded and was obviously of significance?
Well, I think the point I'd probably challenge is of significance. I think it is genuinely impossible for every single conversation between two cabinet ministers, whoever they are, to be recorded. I mean, there aren't civil servants following cabinet ministers through the division lobbies on a typical evening where they might be chatting about something, or if I was having lunch with my family in the garden at the same time that the Prime Minister was on a typical weekend in Downing Street, and we'd obviously be chatting as we were barbecuing or something. I mean, it's clearly impractical to think that every single conversation between two cabinet ministers can be recorded in that way, but I think everyone would accept that. But I think that's obviously fine, because what is happening is when there are formal decisions to be made and formal conversations to be had, those are happening with officials, they are minuted, they're happening in cabinet committees or COVID-Os or COVID-Ss or in cabinet itself or in bilateral meetings, and the decision itself is made in those forums, and that's ultimately what matters, is the decision and how it was made and who fed into it, and that's all a matter of public record and recorded correctly. I mean, I think it's implausible to think that every single conversation between two cabinet ministers could be recorded in that way. I mean, it's not practical or plausible.
All right. Page 3 of the same article, and maybe you've got something to say about what should be taken from this article generally, but on page 3, you refer to in general terms, you refer to the conversations that you had with the Prime Minister and to the debate that went on constantly around the Prime Minister as to what decisions should be taken. You say a cost-benefit calculation, a basic requirement for pretty much every public health intervention, was never made, or at least that's what the journalist has said you were implying. I wasn't allowed to talk about the trade-off, says Sunak. Ministers were briefed by Number 10 on how to handle questions about the side effects of lockdown. The script was never not to ever acknowledge them. The script was, there's no trade-off because doing this for our health is good for the economy. We need to be quite clear, don't we, that the reality was that the Chancellor of the Exchequer, yourself, and HMT took every opportunity to bring to the attention of the Prime Minister the potential consequences of the lockdown decisions and the fiscal and economic harm that would be done. That's very apparent. Would you agree with that?
Yes, that was my primary responsibility, and that's what we did.
And if we look at 182359, this is an analytical note which expressly refers to it being a trade-off between continuing COVID-19 social distancing and minimising foregone economic activity and other costs, was this a document produced by HMT dated the 22nd of April, provided to the Quad group of ministers, that's to say, the group of yourself, the first Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Raab, Mr. Gove and Mr. Hancock, whilst the Prime Minister was ill. So a Treasury document that expressly addresses the trade-off between continuing social distancing and economic activity.
I'm not familiar with that document, so I don't know if it's clear who
you may
it's
not
come
know
from.
the individual document, but...
Well, I do recall, because of the person who wrote it, I worked with him in a previous guise, and I don't think he did work at Treasury. I thought he was in a different department, so it's not obvious to me that the document does come from the Treasury or not. So I can't say that it does come from the Treasury. My point, though, referring to the quote you had from the Spectator article previously, was not about the substance of the discussions that were happening in government, which, as you rightly said, and I was making the point about some of the consequences. Again, not just economic, but the other impacts in all other walks of life as well. The point was about the communication strategy. And I can certainly sympathise, actually, with a communication strategy that wanted to simplify things, because we were dealing with something that was, again, unprecedented. We didn't know how people would respond, behave, comply. And so the sense was a simpler communication strategy would be better for achieving that objective, and it was just better to focus on the health impacts, and because that would be the way to improve compliance. And I have sympathy. That's a reasonable argument to make, but that argument that was made to achieve that aim came at the cost of not having from the beginning a broader conversation about the other impacts and other walks of life. And again, impacts that may not be felt immediately, but would be felt down the line. And I think that was the approach of the communication strategy. That's what I was referring to in the Spectator article. And again, it doesn't mean that it was wrong, by the way, because I think it's a reasonable position to have taken that it was better to have a simpler communication strategy that didn't talk about all those other things, because we wanted people to comply with what we were asking them to do. Reasonable position. I was making the point that I think you could have said, actually, we could have had a broader conversation from the beginning about some of these things. That was the point I was making in the article. But this document, as I said, I don't know or recollect.
The article itself makes no reference to this being a comms issue. It simply quotes you as saying the script was not to ever acknowledge them. The script was there's no trade-off because doing this for our health is good for the economy. But you say that was just a question of communication.
Yes, because I think if you can bring it back.
Page 3 of 280042. And it's the top of the page, Mr. Sunak.
Yes, that is talking about the common strategy, because it's what you're allowed to talk about. It says very specifically, and then again, not my words, but the author's words, ministers were briefed by number 10 on how to handle questions about the side effects of lockdown. That, again, is briefing before people do media appearances. And the script, in a generic sense, probably refers to the standard what number 10 produces and still produces to this day as a kind of broadcast script or broadcast brief that has the government's overall public-facing narrative. So that is very much what those comments are talking about.
But there was no doubt whatsoever, as far as you could tell, in the public's mind, that as Chancellor, you were warning of the economic and fiscal consequences of lockdowns, that your position and HMT's position was that there is a trade-off. If you make a decision if you make a decision to lock down, it's going to be enormously damaging. I mean, that was your raison d'etre, was it not?
I think that, maybe I wouldn't quite put it like that, but my, I'd say, almost constitutional responsibility as Chancellor of the Exchequer was to make sure that the Prime Minister had the economic, the analysis and the advice relating to the economic and fiscal implications or consequences of the decisions that he was considering. Of course, that was my job, and of course, that's what I did. And I don't think it's controversial, and indeed, even I see now in the evidence that's been submitted to the inquiry by many of the scientists from SAGE acknowledging that the benefit I think the chief science advisor at the time former chief science advisor said that the benefits of imposing lockdowns had to be balanced by policymakers against the social, health, and other economic detriments that they would cause. I think Professor Edmonds said policymakers had to weigh up many other ethical, logistical, and economic constraints. And again, I could quote, actually the previous chief science advisor also said there were costs in other domains of life, economic, people's well-being, education, all those needed to be analysed. So I don't think it's particularly controversial to say that, of course, there are lots of other impacts that come from decisions. My particular responsibility was to make sure that the economic ones were considered, or the Prime Minister had an opportunity to consider them.
It is obvious that you've spoken.
There's a separate question. Sorry to interrupt. And then there's a separate question about how much it is appropriate to talk about those in public, which is what this refers to.
We need to be clear about this, Mr. Sunak. You made no bones about the fact that there was a trade-off, that there were huge, it's self-evident, devastating economic and societal consequences from the lockdown decisions. That is obvious. The whole country knows that. The Chancellor of the Exchequer yourself made no bones about it. The Treasury raised quite properly, perhaps constitutionally, all the concerns that needed to be raised. But you reject the suggestion, which appears to be given by this article, that full debate, the nature of the trade-off, wasn't properly identified, or at least wasn't properly ventilated by you, perhaps because of briefings by Number 10. And I want to ask you whether that was in fact correct.
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Did ministers brief you, or rather did Number 10 brief you, that you couldn't raise the obvious issue of the economic and fiscal harm that would be done by a lockdown decision? Was that not, in fact, a debate that was obvious to everybody, and it was a debate in which you played a full part?
As I said, that debate was certainly something that happened in the deliberations. As we've previously been discussing, it didn't happen particularly extensively for the first lockdown because everything happened very quickly at that point and was driven, as I said, largely by the public health advice. Over time, that debate became I'd say more a feature of the discussions, particularly because we started to have more understanding and evidence of the impact on the short term, at least, of what lockdowns were doing, or the MPIs were doing in other domains or other walks of life. So that was the kind of evolution of the debate inside of government. As I said, from a comm strategy, very understandably, as I said, reasonable people can disagree. Simplicity of message is often important, and the simpler message was just to focus on the public health side of it earlier on. And again, I think that evolved over time. And if you compare what was said in press conferences in the autumn, for example, when these debates were happening, it had evolved by that period of time. Earlier on, it was certainly not a feature. I think you can just see that if you watch all the press conferences. And then when you get to the autumn, you have, I think, in the press conferences, a much more open discussion about the fact that there are all these other things that policymakers have to take into account. These aren't easy decisions, they're balanced decisions. They're all different types of impact. You had, whether it's Chris Whitty or Patrick Vallance saying all the things that I've just said in press conferences in September and October, I don't think you would find that type of communications or forming part of the message earlier on in the pandemic. I think that's probably fair to say.
Right. Can we have 236-586, page 1, please, which is an email from your principal private secretary, Elizabeth Perelman, dated the 6th of June 2020. The subject, Prime Minister, is read out Friday bilat. Is bilat a shorthand for the meetings that you had bilaterally with the Prime Minister?
Yes.
On NPI, non-pharmaceutical easements, non-pharmaceutical intervention easements, no actions for teams, just for info only. Your principal private secretary says, following the inconclusive strategy meeting, the Prime Minister, Chancellor met and discussed the plan for NPI easements on Friday. No other minister included, shows the strength of the Chancellor's voice in these discussions. This email, did you see this email after the event? Did you see the readout? Do you recall?
No, I wouldn't typically see these readouts.
She does appear there to be referring to how as the Chancellor, because of your ability to meet bilaterally with the Prime Minister, your voice carried a particular strength. Would you agree?
I'm not entirely sure I would agree in any disproportionate sense. It's completely normal for the Prime Minister to meet with the Chancellor bilaterally. I do the same now in this job. Previous Prime Minister did the same. I mean, that's unsurprising.
So that we're not at cross purposes. There is no suggestion, any impropriety, meeting with the Prime Minister bilaterally. You are the Chancellor. He is the Prime Minister. It's a vital relationship to the workings of government. But I want to ask you to assess the strength of your voice in those discussions on the issues which directly concerned the pandemic, because of the debate about SAGE and the MPI easements and so on.
As I've already said, I felt I always had the opportunity to convey my thoughts and provide advice to the Prime Minister. I said that early on. And that happened in a range of forums, whether in these bilateral meetings or through the smaller group meetings or the COVID-O or the COVID-S. I've been, I think, consistent in my evidence that I always felt I had the opportunity to provide the Prime Minister with advice.
Indeed.
I wouldn't read anything particularly into the fact that I had a bilateral meeting with him. I'm sure he was having bilateral meetings with other ministers as well, all part of how he would like to make decisions, and that ultimately is a question for him. But for my part, of course, I had the opportunity to feed in.
If we look at page 2, we can see a reference to next steps. And after a list of next steps or actions which are envisaged to be taken, your principal private secretary says this: on Monday, I'm just going to check where number 10 have got to and ensure on track for Tuesday. Until announced, you never know. That would appear on one reading to be a reference to an understanding held by her that there was a degree of backing and veering or change in position, or perhaps just debate within number 10, which meant that until decisions were actually announced, there was a risk they might not be adhered to. Would you agree?
I think I touched on it in my responses earlier, that decision-making is a process. And every Prime Minister will have a different process by which they want to make decisions. And that would just be different depending on the personality style of the person in the job. But my experience of the previous Prime Minister was, and I think entirely rightly, that for big decisions, he would want to go over the arguments, test out different points of view. He might do some of that bilaterally with ministers, do some of it in smaller group meetings, and through that process, again, same way that you develop policy or I develop policy as Chancellor, that process of discussion, debate, reviewing evidence and analysis might change your mind on something. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Over the many policy development processes that I've personally been involved in as Chancellor, it might well be the case that you come to a question with an intuitive view of what you think is right, and over the course of a policy development process, going over the analysis, the evidence, hearing from people, that you think, well, I did think that, but it's clear now, having reviewed everything, that that wasn't right, or we should do it a different way. I think that's entirely normal, particularly when you're dealing with something that is uncertain and unprecedented. It's not surprising that that happens, and I don't necessarily think that it is a bad thing. I think it shows that someone is engaging with the process and hearing from different people before you get to a final decision meeting in the right format, COVID-O, COVID-S, cabinet, etc. But I don't think it's necessarily, as I said, a bad thing that over the course of a process the Prime Minister would want to hear different points of view before coming to a final decision. And it may well be that, during that process you hear different things which challenge thoughts that you had before.
236594, page 1, is another email from Elizabeth Perelman to various recipients in the Treasury. We can see at the bottom of that first page, the Chancellor in particular wanted to thank you, the economic team, the health team and the COVID team for all the work. The briefs and information meant the Chancellor was well armed to challenge and scrutinise the proposal. I should say this is dated the 9th of October, Prime Minister. and had a level of detail beyond the rest of the room which allowed us to make and land our points with a great result. An outline of the wider discussion is below, but afterwards there was a smaller Prime Minister Chancellor huddle, and the upshot is no final decision has been taken on the MPIs. And then over the page, please. However, the Prime Ministerial steer is that he's not minded to agree to the Cabinet Office proposal. His preference is either to do nothing or close pubs only. And then, under the bulleted points, clearly there is a high risk that this is unpicked over Friday the weekend. So 2 questions, please, Mr. Sunak. Firstly, the reference to the fact that there was a huddle between yourself and the Prime Minister after the general debate appears to suggest that with this Prime Minister there was an ability to get the last word in, to meet with him and to be able to influence his ultimate decision. And secondly, the reference to unwinding and unpicking a position which appears to have been agreed suggests that this wasn't an open-ended debate which led to a consistent decision. There was the ability to be able to unwind or unpick a position which had already been reached. Do you agree with both those propositions or neither?
Well, obviously I didn't write the email,
No.
so I don't know precisely what it refers to. And is it possible that I might have had a chat with the Prime Minister once a meeting wound up on my way back somewhere? Of course that's possible. He might have said to me, that was interesting, I'm thinking X as a result of it. I mean, I don't think anything particularly wrong with that, right? I mean, I don't call it huddle or not. It might be just that he might have just giving me a sense of where his head was at that particular moment in time. And again, I don't think there's anything particularly untoward about that, to be honest. And as I've talked previously about decision-making processes, and ultimately there would be a final decision taken at an appropriate forum. It might well be that there had been an iterative process leading up to that. But again, I don't think in and of itself that is necessarily a bad thing. And again, I'm not entirely sure what this specifically refers to.
You refer to the fact that there might be an issue as to where his head is at, where the Prime Minister has reached in terms of his thinking. And I need to ask you, because of the evidence which has been given by his former cabinet secretaries, his former chief advisor, his former director of communications, also by privately his chief scientific advisor, that he had a tendency to back and veer, to bear the impression of the last person who sat in him in terms of the debates which were raging in Downing Street, and that this led to a degree of chaos, or to use Sir Patrick Vance's words, operational inefficiency. Were you aware that his closest advisors had seemingly unanimously taken the view that there was a lack of efficiency? The administration is described privately as brutal and useless, or criminally incompetent, or operationally chaotic. Was any of that known to you?
No, I don't think any of those comments were shared with me at the time. You made a point, though, Mr. Kyiv. You said debates raged. I don't think that is necessarily a bad thing.
No, indeed.
I mean, it's right that there was vigorous debate, because these were incredibly consequential decisions for tens of millions of people in all spheres, whether it was health, whether it was education, whether it was economic, whether it was social, whether it was the long-term impacts. These were incredibly big decisions, the likes of which no Prime Minister had taken in decades, if ever, like this. So the fact that there was debate and that people were passionate about it and they had different points of view is I think, A, unsurprising, and B, good, because it would be worse if we were having this conversation and all the commentary was, well, there was no debate about any of this whatsoever. It was all just signed off straightforward. Someone put a piece of paper, someone checked, and that was the last we heard of it. I think that would actually be far worse, quite frankly. It's good that there was debate about these things. Now, in terms of operational inefficiency, again, there is no perfect amount of deliberation versus speed. That's a trade-off that only the Prime Minister can make. Again, and it will be context dependent, it will be decision dependent, so it's hard to generalise what the right amount of deliberative time is. But as I've talked about the process, I don't think it's a problem that the Prime Minister gets advice from different people, mulls over it, tries out different arguments, assuming there is the time to do that before coming to a final decision. I think it's a good thing that there was debate, because debate was required when you're dealing with consequences of the sort that we were.
How often, if at all, Mr. Sunak, did you leave Downing Street or leave number 10 Downing Street after debating issues with the Prime Minister, perhaps in a bilateral or multilateral conversation, and been told that a decision had been reached or that his view was X, to find out later that his view had changed or that a decision had been unwound or unpicked? Can you recall any such instance of that happening over this particularly fraught period from March through to October?
I'm sure it did. I mean, we've had to make so many decisions over the course of 2 years.
But we know which decisions are the most important. We know the momentous decisions, Mr. Sunak. Did he change his mind when you had been given to understand that he had reached a view on the decisions which you and his closest advisers were debating at such ferocious length?
Again, I think if you could be more specific, I mean, if we talk about the first, there were many momentous decisions, right? So, I mean, that's why this is an important piece of work that is extensive. But we'll get into, if we talk chronologically, the decisions around the first lockdown, no, I don't think that happened. Because, we haven't got into it yet, and we haven't touched on the economic analysis, which I think we'll come to later, you said, where I can talk about the economic context we're operating in. But, my strong recollection of those few weeks in March was that advice was put to the government, to the Prime Minister from Sage, and advice was followed pretty much imminently on the same day in most cases, if not all cases, during that period. The advice changed from Sage during that period, but the government, when the advice changed, the government acted. The Prime Minister didn't say, I'm going to do this and then I'm going to change. We were sitting there, we got the advice about when we should implement self-isolation, household isolation, originally not to close schools, not to ban mass events. Things changed, particularly on the 16th of March. That's when the advice from Sage changed considerably about the speed of implementation. But again, Prime Minister reacted. Schools were closed on, I think, that was announced on the 18th, because that was put before the committee at the time. And again, that was just acted on immediately, I think the same day, both on the 16th and the 18th. I think the Prime Minister stood up the same day and announced those decisions. And again, even up to about, I think, the 19th of March, the view from Sage, the view from the Chief Medical Officer was that the existing measures that had been announced, if there was, in their words, 75% compliance, they should do the trick. Right? And again, then it was clear that compliance maybe wasn't high enough and further interventions had to be put in place. But my strong recollection in that period of all those decisions is there wasn't we do one thing and then change our minds. It was just the government responding to the advice from their scientific advisors. The scientific advice changed, and then the government obviously changed with it. But there wasn't, I think that's not, again, that's what the government did at that time. It followed the advice from the scientists and didn't change its mind.
And may we take it, because you've referred to the first lockdown decision by way of your answer, may we take it that the same position took place, the same position was reached in relation to the later decisions, for example, roadmaps and easements, circuit breakers, package A, tiers, and so on and so forth? Are you saying that there was a consistent, clear position adopted by Downing Street after the debate that obviously took place, and decisions weren't made, which were then unpicked, or that there was a consistent approach adopted? I mean, for those later periods.
You just named, I think, almost 6 different decisions, all of which probably merit, and I'm sure we will have a fulsome discussion on each of them.
But I'm asking you just generally, your impression as the Chancellor. Were you a Chancellor in an administration in which there was an absence of clear, consistent decision-making following full and robust debate? Or was it your impression that the decisions were being made properly? that there was a proper opportunity for everybody to have their say, and then the Prime Minister took decisions and stuck to them? Which is it?
So I can only answer for myself in terms of, did everyone have the ability they wanted to feed in, ultimately, because I'm not, I don't know the extent to which other cabinet ministers felt that they were sufficiently included or fed in or met the Prime Minister. It's a question for them. I've been consistently clear. For my part, I did have that ability from the beginning and throughout to feed in to decision making. And as I said, throughout, it's right that there was debate and discussion and debate. That's my general recollection. There weren't decisions that were made by fiat. There was good debate and discussion about decisions as we went. And unfortunately, we were just dealing with an unpredictable situation which people hadn't experienced before. And so did things have to iterate as we went along? Of course they did. And we'll get into that, I'm sure, when we address each of those individual decisions that you mentioned. Now, in each of those, of course, there would have been a period of iteration where we adjust the circumstances or facts as they changed. Don't think that is wrong, and I think it's hard to generalise, but what we should do is go into each of those things in detail, as I look forward to doing, and I'm sure we will over the course of today.
We will. The first lockdown decision was taken on the 23rd of March. In your statement, you relay, as you said this morning, your general impression that the recommendations which were being made in public health terms were strongly supported, and there was a sense of the sooner the better that they were implemented, because the majority of the advice, indeed the vast majority of the advice that the government was receiving in those weeks of the 9th and the 16th of March, focused upon the public health considerations, the exponential nature of the growth curve, the damage that would be done and the ultimate collapse of the NHS, and of course on the number of deaths, the mortality that would ensue. Can you recall, Mr. Sunak, your take on and your recollection of the robustness of the data underpinning the proposition that the NHS would collapse? It was obviously debated by you and others at the meeting on the Monday, the 23rd. It was debated at all the COBRAs and the cabinet meetings hitherto. What was the understanding that you had? Was it undoubtedly going to be the case that the NHS would collapse, or was it a question of it's in peril, there are very grave concerns as to whether or not it'll be overwhelmed or overtopped, but we've got to see to what extent surge capacity and the heroic efforts of the NHS itself could save the day? Where was the final line reached?
You know, I can't specifically recall the analysis that was presented. My overall recollections of this period, which may be helpful for context,
Please.
were obviously we were starting to get information coming in about COVID internationally. The general response was being led by DH. I think you will be familiar with the contain, delay strategy, which is what we were advised by the scientific experts to follow. The strategy was, as you said, to prevent the NHS from being overwhelmed. I vividly recall at the time the chief scientific advisor saying, and I think it's recorded in the minutes, that the strategy was not to completely suppress the disease, right? Which I think there was a misunderstanding about this, but he was very explicit that wouldn't work, and that would just lead to a later second peak later in the year, which did overwhelm the NHS. So what they wanted to do was flatten the curve, change the epidemiological shape, and they were very concerned about going too early. Right, the general advice from them was they were worried about implementing these things too early. They said that in private, but also in private in the meetings, but also in public in the press conferences. But you're right. Increasingly, it became, well, the advice we were getting was the NHS was imminently in danger of being overwhelmed. Incrementally, more and more measures were implemented. New modelling came out, I think, around the 16th, which changed the timing that Sage had worked to previously. Government acted on that, acted again on the 18th. And as I said, I think Chris Whitty on about the 19th was clear that the decisions we'd made, having closed schools at that point, were announced. So if there was good compliance, should be sufficient. That turned out not to be the case, and obviously subsequent measures were implemented. I don't remember the specific analysis that we were shown about the NHS being overwhelmed. I don't think I would have been in any position to challenge it if it was coming from the NHS at that moment.
But and how much of the debate on that Monday revolved around an understanding of what the impact on the NHS might be? The reason I ask, so that you can understand the genesis of the question, Prime Minister, is that there was a great deal of information about beds and ICU beds and the number of beds and so on, and how many would be needed and whether they'd be overwhelmed and so on. But there was also a fair amount of information from the NHS as to what could be done by way of additional surge capacity, whether the NHS would survive, whether it could survive. And given that ultimately the decision to lock down rested, at least in part, on what the impact on the NHS would be likely to be if that decision were not taken, we need to know to what extent the actuality of the impact on the NHS was debated. Was it taken as said that there would be a collapse and therefore you had to act? Was there a detailed debate about the reality of the NHS and whether or not, in fact, an alternative position could be taken which wouldn't inevitably lead to the collapse of the NHS?
So I can't specifically recall. You're absolutely right. There was a lot of talk about ICUs and monitoring of ICUs, what was happening. And then you had the forecast from the scientific advisors with degrees of infection and hospitalizations. And then, as far as I can remember, but I might be confusing it with a later period, you could easily plot the curves of here's a line of NHS capacity, here's the predicted emissions.
There were curves then, undoubtedly.
And look, of course, you would look to see, well, how can we improve capacity through nightingales or flexing staffing ratios, all these types of things, which we did. I don't think I was in a particular position, or I don't remember there being enormous challenge of those assumptions that we were presented with the NHS. I'll be honest, though, I can't precisely recall, but I think it was just I think it was largely taken if they were saying we were going to be overwhelmed in a matter of days or weeks if this carries on this projected curve. There wasn't an enormous amount of disagreement with that. Regardless, we should do everything we can to increase capacity, and I think we did, investing in nightingales in particular, and changing staffing ratios was the other thing that helped. But I don't precisely, as I said, recall the data that was presented and the debate that was had around it. But you are right that was what was driving everything. I said it was not a total suppression, and I think this is where this issue of herd immunity came out.
So sorry for interrupting. Can we address herd immunity and the other strategic or the conceptual issue separately?
Sure.
Just finally on this question of the NHS, in hindsight, Prime Minister, and you've looked back at the documentation from that weekend, of course, and on the Monday, and the COBRA meeting on the Monday at 5 p.m. and the Cabinet meeting, which took place afterwards, after the public announcement on the Tuesday. Are you surprised by a relative absence of hard data as to the direct impact on the NHS and on the amount of debate which was directed towards working out what really would happen to the NHS if, by contrast to taking that further ultimate step on the Monday, the government had simply waited to see whether or not the measures imposed in good faith the previous week should be given more time to work?
So one of my more general reflections on this whole thing, but particularly on this period as well, is about data and access to good data. I think it's very clear that early on there just wasn't the quality and timeliness of the data in all areas that you would have liked in order to make decisions. I think that's clear. Now, that improved over time, I think. So the good news is, I'd like to believe if this happened again, actually we now know the data that we need and are able to get it in terms of monitoring the progression of the virus or what's happening in the economy or the testing, all these things, including the NHS. Do I think at this moment in time the data was perfect? I doubt it was. I can't remember it precisely. I would assume it will be much improved today compared to as it was then about our ability to know exactly what was happening in various hospitals. And to your broader, so I think a general reflection, look, I agree, data was not as good as it could have been at the beginning. I think that improved over time and would be a big lessons learned for me. To your broader point about was there enough attention scrutiny on this, this was all happening very quickly. As the advice was coming in from the people at Sage, it was essentially just acted on I think on the 12th, on the 16th, on the 18th, on the 20th and the 23rd. Sorry, I know you're referring to days, and I think about it as dates in my head. So if you could translate your Mondays and Sundays into dates, it would help me. But those are the key dates that I remember in the key meetings. I think the 16th is when the advice from Sage changed about the timing of implementation. Government, I think, made an announcement same day. 18th, again,
indeed,
conversation about London.
Will you forgive me if
sorry,
because we're going to be looking at it after the break in a bit more detail. But
okay.
I didn't suggest to you that the data was not as it could have been at the beginning, to which you lent your assent by saying I agree. There was obviously data before you and your colleagues from the NHS sit reps, which were daily. There was data in relation to the number of beds, the number of ICU beds, and so on. There was data in relation to the infection fatality rates, the hospitalisation rate, and so on. The broad position was plain as a pikestaff. You knew what the position was in the NHS, and you knew what the position was in terms of hospitalisation and fatality rates. My question to you is, are you surprised at the relative absence of debate in those final ultimate decision-making meetings as to what really would happen to the NHS if you decided not to impose a mandatory stay-at-home order? I mean,
as I remember it, I think actually you have to remember there were all these scenes. What people talked about a lot was Lombardy, right? I think people could. It was in Italy, that region of Italy. There were these scenes of the hospitals being overwhelmed, and I think that was very much in people's consciousness at the time. Was the scenes from Lombardy, what happened in Lombardy, and needing to avoid that happening in the UK. So I think that was the kind of emotional backdrop to these conversations. And you're absolutely right. Of course, the NHS presented all the data on ICU and all that, and it was based on the combination of the scientific modelling of what was going to happen to hospital admissions and the NHS saying, well, obviously, if you have admissions up here and capacity down here, it's a pretty poor outcome for everybody. I don't remember the degree of scrutiny over those assumptions of saying, no, you guys are just being very conservative. Clearly, you can treat 5 times as many people as you think. I don't remember those precise conversations. They may well have happened. I wouldn't have any particular ability to challenge them, I don't think. I mean, if the chief medical officer and the head of the NHS are telling you this is the amount of staff we've got, this is how many are going to be off sick themselves, this is the maximum number of people or the ratio we can have of ICU nurses to a bed, even if we flex it, it's probably hard for me to say, well, you're wrong, right? I mean, I could probably say, well, they've done this over here or done this over there, but again, this is not my lane, so to speak. But
this was, of course, one of the most momentous decisions in the history of this nation. A great deal of water was passed under the bridge. The decision taken at that 5 p.m. meeting.
On what when you say the 5 p.m. meeting, what date?
Monday, the 23rd of March, the decision to impose a mandatory stay-at-home order, followed by the Prime Ministerial announcement, and then the Cabinet meeting the following day. It all revolved around that decision. My suggestion to you is that debate just didn't take place, or if it did, it didn't take place to the degree to which it should.
I can't precisely recall that particular meeting, but as I said, the track record of all those meetings, 16th, 18th, 19th, or 20th and 23rd, was the government following the scientific advice that was put in front of it about the right MPIs to implement and at what time, based on protecting the NHS, as you said.
Thank you. Milady, is that a convenient moment?
Certainly. We'll break till 12:05.
All right.